First off, some more context for tonight. Why are we here? As well, they're proposing, OPG and the province are proposing to rebuild the 4 Darlington reactors. So they're about 70 kilometers from here. And they're starting an environmental assessment. So an environmental assessment is supposed to identify what are the potential environmental impacts from a project, and then how could we perhaps mitigate them. So it's supposed to be a document that would inform public opinion on, are we ready to tolerate these types of environmental risks? Well, it's funny, as Angela mentioned, last week we got the commitment out of the Quebec government to close the Pickering nuclear, or the Gentil nuclear station. And just something to kind of boost your morale, I've been working on that campaign for about 10 years. And in 2003, when they were starting out the environmental assessment in Quebec, we also had a meeting like this with a lot fewer people. Where we started to talk, they want to do this project. They're proposing an EA, and what's interesting is how things don't change a lot. The EA they proposed at the time also basically excluded a lot of the risks and environmental impacts from the environmental assessment. And they're doing that for a reason. They don't want the public to understand the full risk and the full costs of the project. We intervened in that process anyhow. We did it partly to bear witness to what was going wrong, but also to be able to say to the decision makers, this is wrong, you should not be allowed to do this. And in doing that, we developed a lot of credibility on the ground with other politicians, with other environmental groups and civil society groups that eventually built a large coalition in Quebec that got that reactor shut down. And that's what we can also do here. But it's like it's 2003, except it's 2012, and it's 4 reactors instead of 1. But we can do this. So the government, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission has put out a really boring document. It's called the screening report. It's the lowest level environmental impact statement. And they're holding hearings in November, on November 13th and 14th. And you have the ability to, they're basically asking your opinion. Like, do you agree with this? Do you think we've addressed all the risks? So you have the right to tell the federal government, you know what, I don't think your environmental impact statement is acceptable because you have admitted, as you'll hear from a number of us tonight, a number of the risks and impacts. And you have the right to say, this is what I think you should do about it. Before you proceed with this project, I want you to look at large accidents. Before you approve this project, I want you to look at more in-depth at health impacts. So that's what's in front of us, and on Monday there's a deadline. If you'd like to get a written submission in, it's 4 days, but nothing like a deadline to sharpen the mind. If you'd like to do that intervention, there's a lot of other people that'll be doing that as well. And just as in Quebec in 2004, we had hearings on the BAP, and that was the start of where a coalition formed that got that reactor shut down. So what I'm going to speak to you about tonight are, the focus of my speak is on lessons from Fukushima and the proposed Darlington project. I visited both Fukushima and Chernobyl last year with Greenpeace. I'm a radiation safety advisor with the organization. And the one takeaway that I have from that experience last year was that while they will say in this environmental impact statement, we find everything is satisfactory based on they've met all the safety standards or environmental standards, everything's fine as long as it's in that big concrete dome. Once this radiation gets out of that dome, it's just a mess. I stood 30 kilometers from this, just outside of the evacuation zone. And we have something called a gamma spectrometer. You can identify what the radioisotopes are. I could see cesium on the ground in low levels, but it was spread all across Japan. And so that country has been irreparably changed by this experience. And that's part of the risk that we will take if this project is approved. So what I would like to take you through tonight are 3 things. 1, what are the lessons we can learn from Fukushima? 2, how are those applicable to Darlington as a project? And 3, what are the problems with this environmental assessment? What information are they holding back that a credible environmental assessment should have? So to start, it's important to understand in this document, that screening report, they use the word safe over and over and over. And I guess if you did a word search and search for safety versus risk, you'd see the word safety a lot more. And it's important to understand how the CNSC and OPG use the word safety, because they're using it in a way that normal people wouldn't. So when the nuclear industry says something is safe, what they really mean is they believe, in their theory, there will be a meltdown only once every 1,000,000 years of reactor operation. So that's when they say safety, that's what they mean. And that I just heard some people go, yeah, it seems not normal, and it's not. But this is their theory, and this is what they've been promoting for the past several decades. When they say we should opt for nuclear power, it has some problems, but it's basically safe. Well, that's their theory. Now, there's about 440 reactors operating in the world today. And so if you add up all the reactor hours or years, there's about 14,000 that have taken place. We've had 5 meltdowns. So their theory, we're not seeing in reality. Usually, if the facts change, you change your theory. But we haven't seen that out of this industry, from OPG, from the province, or the regulator yet. Other countries have said, yeah, the theory's way off. Japan, Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, and they're all just simply saying this risk isn't worth it. But in this environmental impact statement, they're still relying on this despite Fukushima. And a normal person has the right to say, I do not accept that. So what we're seeing in reality is we're seeing a major nuclear accident somewhere in the world once every 10 years. It's not a low probability event, it's a regular event. So you could accept that. And if you are going to accept that, there's some other things we should do, and we'll talk about that. But that's the difference between they use the word safety and perhaps how we would use the word safety. And so what is the lesson from Fukushima? Well, we'll hear this from the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission and Ontario Power Generation, that, well, that doesn't matter because we're in Ontario and there's not going to be a level 8 earthquake followed by a tsunami. It just won't happen on Lake Ontario, so don't worry about that. Well, the fact of the matter is, Japan, the Japanese, are experts in earthquake risks and tsunamis. They advise other countries in the world on how to protect their reactors from tsunami risks. 2 weeks before the Fukushima disaster happened, they gave a life extension to the Fukushima station. They said, just go ahead, it's a bit of a rubber stamp. Unfortunately, what we've learned post the accident is both TEPCO, the operator of the Fukushima reactors, and the regulator in Japan had the risk studies that showed they should expect such a tsunami about once every 1,000 years. What did they do about it? Nothing. They knew about the risk, they had it in their studies, but they did not act. This is something called institutional failure. When you get institutions regulating very complex industries and they become in their own worldview, they just start dismissing risk, that's when you get these big accidents. And so there's other examples of it. If you go back in history through 3 Mile Island and the Chernobyl disaster, you'll see similar conclusions, saying it was institutional failure. The banking crisis in 2009, big complex industry, institutional failure. The oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, institutional failure. So what they're going to say to us over and over again is this technology is robust, we have defense in depth, we can prevent these accidents. But in reality, it's not the technology, it's the humans and their institutions causing those accidents. And I've been to Japan, we're not so different from the Japanese. So that's one of the first lessons, and this has not been acknowledged by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. So we're seeing an empirical probability, but once every 10 years, somewhere in the world, we're seeing an accident. That's a lesson. So that's how we should be thinking about this risk. Some countries have opted to just get out of nuclear altogether. We haven't done that yet. But another lesson is we need independent regulators. One of the lessons in Japan, one of the first things they did is their nuclear regulator was under the same ministry that promotes nuclear power. And that's where they got into this problem of just like, that's not a big deal. So these are lessons from Fukushima that you're not going to find in that report. And I can tell you that because I've asked them to put it in this environmental review. I participated in the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission's Fukushima task force. I presented there in May. I presented this Greenpeace report, for example, that we put out. The probability number I presented. And it was very funny how the commission reacted. One of the commissioners said to their staff, Greenpeace has this very hard and fast number that once every 10 years, somewhere in the world, we're seeing an accident. How do you react to that? And what did the staff say? Well, Greenpeace just divided. Simple division. They dismissed it. I've had a scientist since then who saw my presentation from Carleton call me up and say, oh, you're completely correct. They're way off. You should be putting empirical data into your models, and they're not doing that. We asked them to at least acknowledge institutional failure in the Fukushima review. They refused. They said it was out of scope. They just looked at tsunami risks and earthquake risks. And in this EA review as well, when there was a draft document, I just asked for them to put it in writing. Just say, one of the causes of Fukushima was institutional failure. They refused to even put those words in the document. This document is so sanitized. And it's not just Greenpeace saying this. A month after I presented to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the Japanese government put out their own report on the causes of Fukushima, and it came to the exact same conclusion: institutional failure. So, and why should we be concerned about this? Well, if humans and regulatory bodies are part of the cause of accidents, we need to be worried about it in Canada because we have similar conditions. So the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the commission that watchdogs nuclear safety in Canada, well, you may forget this because we're all so obsessed with pipelines now. But before we were politicizing pipeline reviews, the Harper government fired the former president of the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. It's this woman, Linda Keane. And I'll tell you this, there was no love lost between me and Linda Keane while she was here. But now that she's gone, I kind of miss her. And why did they fire Linda Keane? Well, one of the things she was doing was she was imposing modern international nuclear safety standards on Canadian nuclear operators. She said this after being fired. She said basically SNC-Lavalin, the company that wants to get the contract to rebuild Darlington, hired Hill and Knowlton to get her fired. And the Harper government accepted. It's her words, not ours. So here we have an instance. This sent a signal to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. We want to promote. We prioritize nuclear risks or making money over protecting Canadians. So this is a situation that we have a problem with. I asked the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission in May, you should acknowledge what happened in Japan. Just ask the federal government to take you out from the ministry that promotes nuclear power. It's the same here as it was in Japan. They refused to do that. So how can we, those are some of the lessons from Fukushima. And are there parallels here in Canada that we should be concerned about in regard to the looming decision on Darlington? Well, one of the big ones is, here's a Google Earth shot of the Darlington nuclear station. So you see there's 4 reactors there. And you'll notice at Fukushima as well, there was 4 reactors. Ontario and Japan are one of the rare places on Earth where we build reactors in big sets. We're building them in sets of 4. And in the past, what they would have said is, well, an accident at more than one of those reactors, that's such a low probability we don't even want to think about it. It's not worth thinking about it. It's not credible. Well, that's exactly what we saw in Japan. You had 3 reactors that, despite all their technology, breached containment, and we had radiation releases, as well as from the fuel pools. But there's another reason why we should be a little more concerned about that here in Ontario. Yeah, tsunami is not going to hit, but at least in Japan, when they built 4 reactors together, they all had separate safety systems. So what that means in terms of engineering, when they're talking about the technology that would protect the public, is for each reactor that there was a meltdown at, it then had to breach containment separately. So 3 of them released radiation. At Darlington, they share 1 containment. And they did that to save money. And one little spooky thing I've been learning over time is how to read their risk studies when they actually release them. They do one thing called core melt probability. So that's like how many once every million years there's a core melt, and then they do a large release frequency. Well, what's interesting, even in their own documents, that frequency is almost the same. So what that tells you is, even though they're like, well, even if there's a meltdown, the containment will hold it, this containment, in terms of engineering, barely does it. So that's a big concern. And this I also asked them to acknowledge in the environmental screening report. They refused, just to put the words. Wouldn't put those in, sanitized. And so even if we were to accept the risks of moving forward with the Darlington project, one thing we should do is like, okay, so we're going to have large releases of radiation once every 10 years somewhere in the world. Let's prepare for it. And what you do in those cases is have emergency plans. So if there is a radiation release, how do you get people out of the way? How do you protect their health? And a number of us participated last year in the very surreal hearings on the Darlington new build project. They started 10 days after the Fukushima disaster started. They refused to pause the hearings to learn from Fukushima. One of the things they did admit, though, in their final report was that, well, if you're going to move forward with this, adding more reactors to this site, you should actually design emergency plans that can deal with an accident involving radiation release from all the reactors at that site. So they said, don't worry about your probability numbers, just do it in a deterministic way. I asked the CNSC again, here's a recommendation from one of your own panels. Why don't you do it in this review now? They refuse. And that's a very simple, it's a very credible, like, okay, maybe I don't believe all the nuclear safety stuff you're saying, but can you at least assure me that you're going to be able to evacuate a larger part of the Greater Toronto area? But they refuse to do that. So parallels, we've got the parallel with regulatory capture. We've got some very specific design flaws that are close to Fukushima. And then with this environmental assessment, when it comes to accidents and malfunctions, it's like business as usual pre-Fukushima. The environmental assessment only looks at accidents involving a little teeny release of radiation. They're accidents that they call credible. So of course, when they come to a conclusion, they're like, well, there's no real adverse environmental effects. So they look at really small ones. We asked them to look at larger ones, but they said, well, that's once every million years. We don't have to do that. We're like, but what about reality? They didn't want to look at that. They refused over and over again, just in the wording, to even admit, like there's one line in the environmental assessment report, the causes of nuclear accidents are well understood. I asked them to put, okay, tell us what those are. And we know that it's human error and institutional error. We have all this documents. Why don't you just write the line? Follow that sentence up. They refused just to add that one sentence. This is how sanitized a document gets. And the other problem with them looking at just at small accidents, not only do we not understand, are able to make an assessment of like, well, if this thing does blow, this is what it'll do to Ontario and our drinking water. It also means we don't test emergency plans. And in Ontario, they developed their emergency plans. There was reviews after 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, which had public involvement of some sort. But we only have detailed emergency plans for 10 kilometers around each reactor. So they can only evacuate, they only have detailed plans around that. Above that, they say, well, it's of such a low probability, we don't really need to put the time and effort into developing those more detailed plans. But what does reality tell us? Well, Fukushima, there's still a 20-kilometer area that is evacuated. 150,000 people or so are still living in camps or with their families in Japan. And Chernobyl, 25 years later, you have a 30-kilometer area that's been evacuated. But we only plan for 10. This is a credible ask to ask of any decision maker. If you're going to do it, at least show us that you have this plan. They refuse to do this in this environmental assessment. And this is a big concern for a number of reasons. One, they're planning to run Darlington until 2055. So right now there's about 475,000, 77,000 around within 20 kilometers of the station. By 2055, there'll probably be about 1 million. And we're not actually saying, is this a good site for a nuclear reactor that we're going to run that long? Can we evacuate that many people? They refuse to answer that question. And that is a credible question for the public to tell them that they should address. So friends of ours at the Canadian Environmental Law Association actually did submission for Durham Nuclear Awareness on concerns around emergency planning. And this is some of their high-level concerns. Again, they only looked at small radiation releases. The original version of the environmental assessment report didn't even have a section on emergency planning. Since then, they've added about 3 paragraphs. But it's one of the biggest things we've taken out of Fukushima as well. And they did not evaluate, a few years ago there was a review on the Pickering nuclear station, on the life extension. They've since abandoned it. But in that environmental review, they looked at emergency plans just on whether they could evacuate that 10-kilometer area all the way to 2060. Well, they didn't even bother doing that in this review, or in the 10-kilometer area, let alone 20 or 30. So this environmental assessment is actually lowering the bar compared to past standards. So when Linda Keane was in charge, they were actually looking at these things more thoroughly. They're doing less now. So in conclusion, hopefully I haven't gone too long, the federal government hasn't actually adequately carried out its mandate, I think, to protect Canadians. They haven't given us a full view of the information on the risks involved in terms of extending this station. And one of the unfortunate things is when you dismiss risks like this, it means you don't address the problems and you look for ways to mitigate it, reduce that risk. Remember, an environmental assessment is about trying to identify types of risks and impacts and then saying, how can we stop that, or are there alternatives? And they haven't done So a recommendation, if you are all able and have the wherewithal, the public asking the CNSC in this review, we should be allowed to understand the consequences of a major accident, Darlington. Just give us the information. And we should ensure that the Greater Toronto area will have evacuation plans that can cope with large accidents, and they haven't done that. And if you want one more motivation for making a submission, the deadline is also my birthday. So every submission that you make is a birthday gift for me. Thanks very much.